Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so I guess we can get started. Hello, everybody. Good to see you today. It is a pleasure to present this a bit different type of session that we planned today. We're hearing from a large funded project called Drugs and Disorder, How to Build Peacetime Economies in the Aftermath of War. And we will be hearing from the team that conducts this research. As I said, this is a large ESRC funded project. And that brings together a consortium of universities in the UK, universities and think tanks and kind of grassroots organizations in the UK, Colombia, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. And they conduct research that intends to be very policy relevant. So it's a bit of a different type of a presentation that we have today that is probably more tackling this policy relevance of research in development studies. And in this case, really trying to push a bit the envelope in the ways in which we think about the relationship between drugs, political turmoil, and development. And to do this, we're hosting some of the members of this team: Jonathan Goodhand, Patrick Meehan, and Frances Thomson. And so without further ado, I'll just give the floor to them. And yeah, and then afterwards we'll have a question and answer session. And I hope that we have a very lively discussion. So without further ado, I'll perhaps start the presentation, and you can guide me as to yeah, who's starting and so on.
Okay, while you're setting up, Helena, I'll get started. I'm Jonathan Goodhand. I'm the principal investigator of the project. Also presenting today is Jan Kohler, who is also part of the team. And I'll talk in a minute about what they're going to be presenting. So as Helena said, this is a large project. It's £7 million funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, involving 12 partners from 4 different countries, involving universities, think tanks, private sector organizations, NGOs. And we are attempting to, as a multidisciplinary team, to develop an approach drawing on mixed methods. And if you can go to the next slide, please, Helena. We're working in 3 countries, 3 of the biggest drug producing countries, Afghanistan and Myanmar producing over 90% of the global supply of opiates, and Colombia more than 50% of the global supply of cocaine. And we're working in 9 different borderland regions of these 3 countries. And the question we're asking ourselves is, the overarching question is a very big one. It's how do war economies become peace economies? And we're interested in one particular resource, obviously, that's playing a role in driving these war economies, and also is having a major impact on so-called kind of notional, at least post-war transitions, illicit drugs. And we are attempting to reframe and kind of think anew about the role of drugs in these contexts. And just to highlight 2 things. Firstly, we're aiming to take drugs out of the kind of domains of criminology and law and security, at least from a policy perspective, and to reframe drugs as a development issue. And to look at drugs from the perspective of drug producing countries in the global south. And there's an emerging consensus, a reformist consensus, that drug issues need to be aligned with the SDGs, with development goals. And this is what we call an integrative agenda. And while we welcome the critique of the war on drugs that has kind of pushed this well, not so new agenda now, we're also critical of some of the assumptions behind it, that all good things come together, that drugs, development and peace building can be pursued as policy fields simultaneously. And we're interested in the trade-offs and the tensions between those different goals. As I said, we're also looking at drugs in borderland spaces, partly because these are zones where drugs tend to be produced and trafficked and increasingly consumed, but also because we think the margins are very, very important for understanding broader processes of development and also peace building. That these borderland areas, although they're frequently seen as being disconnected and ruly and ungovernable and having a comparative advantage in illegality, we see them as highly dynamic and transformative spaces in which processes of accumulation there are affecting process of investment and political stability in metropolitan centers. So the drug production in Nangarhar is shaping property markets in Kabul, in Dubai. And we need to think of borderlands and centers in a kind of relational, kind of dialectic relationship. And that's something we're exploring in our research. So I'm going to go straight into, we're going to go straight into our presentations. We're going to go first zooming into the frontiers of Colombia with Frances Thomson. And then we'll go to the drug intensified borderlands of Myanmar with Patrick Meehan. And finally, we'll go to the illegal trading spaces of the Afghan Iranian and the Afghan Pakistan borderlands with Jan. So over to you, Frances.
Done. Can you hear me now? Sorry, I forget sometimes. I still forget sometimes, still not used to it. Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction, and thank you, Elena, for inviting us here today to this space, and hello to the audience who I cannot see, but anyway, perhaps during the discussion I will see some of you. So in Colombia, our research is led by the Universidad Nacional, and it's mostly focused on coca producers and areas of production, specifically 4 borderland municipalities, which are shown there on the map: Puerto Asís, Tumaco, Tibú, and Santa Marta. The team's work has included archival research, different types of interviews, participant observation, and also a survey which we did just in 2 of those municipalities, Tumaco and Puerto Asís. And the survey was with people who signed up to the National Illicit Crop Substitution Program, called the PENIS for its acronym in Spanish. And that program was born of the 2016 peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC-EP rebels. So the Universidad Nacional team's research covers a lot of different issues, but for the seminar today, I'm just going to give a really quick overview of some of those findings that we presented in our 2020 flagship publication, Voices from the Borderlands, and which highlight, I hope this will become clear, that highlight the centrality of the coca economy and counter-narcotics operations to rural development in these borderlands. Next slide, please, Elena. So one of the key messages we stressed in the report is that the coca economy has enabled people to achieve modest socioeconomic improvements, but that this has come at a huge cost due to the associated violence. In a minute, I will speak a bit more about the costs, about the violence, but first I just want to emphasize how coca incomes have allowed people to access goods and services that might otherwise have been out of reach. For example, coca sharecroppers and coca pickers actually earn enough to save and acquire their own land, which is really quite unusual in Colombia in other rural sectors or other rural economies. For example, you know, would a coffee picker earn enough to eventually save and buy their own land? In other parts of the country, it's you know, probably very unusual. So once established as growers, farmers tend to prioritize investment in their children's education, which is interesting because many actually see this as a way out, a way to exit the coca economy. So this is illustrated in the graph, which is based on the graph you can see on the slide, which is based on the survey we did in Tumaco and Puerto Asís. Next slide, please. one thing that perhaps didn't come through so clearly in the graph we just saw, but also in general in the survey, but was a really strong theme in our interview research, is how important cocoa money has been to investment in household and community infrastructure. And this includes diesel generators or solar panels for electricity, wells, roads, schools, and bridges. In the case of shared infrastructure, it's the Juntas de Acción Comunal, or the community action committees, that organize collective labor initiatives and collect donations, or otherwise organize some kind of fundraising events to pay for the building materials. And I'm just going to pause a minute to let you read this quote on the slide, because it really does give a sense of the difficult conditions in which people live and how they combine their cocoa incomes and community action to solve these problems. Next slide, please. Thank you, Elena. So this brings me to another key message, which we highlighted on our Voices from the Borderlands publication, that despite facing social, economic, and political exclusion, Colombia's cocoa producers are very organized and active citizens. The graph, which is based on our survey, shows that cocoa growers do not have access to essential public services such as running water. And the electricity figure looks quite promising, but actually it's better than it looks because it includes self-provisioned electricity, so solar panels and diesel generators that people have bought for themselves, rather than being connected to a municipal grid or a public service. So cocoa growers lack access also to things like property titles, formal property titles, roads, bridges. These are just a few examples of the ways in which they have been excluded economically. There are also lots of different examples of how they've been excluded politically and socially. But as the quote shows, cocoa growers in Colombia are really organized, and they self-provision what the state does not provide. I thought this quote says quite a lot in a few words. You know, this man said, "With cocoa, we've done everything. With cocoa, we have guaranteed for ourselves."
No, not there. Let's find you scratching things, okay?
I think someone might need to mute their mic. I'll continue. I'm glad it wasn't protest at what I was saying. I thought someone was protesting. With cocoa, we have guaranteed for ourselves as best we can the fundamental rights that the state hasn't given us. For example, the issue of roads. We built our own roads. So in addition to organizing within their own communities, like the examples I've already given, cocoa growers also participate in municipal and departmental and even countrywide or national level meetings. They've also organized strikes and mobilizations to demand things like more state investments, to reject forced eradication, to denounce problems like the impacts of oil operations in their communities or the abuses by state forces, for example. And indeed, the cocaleros actually have organized some of the largest peasant protests in recent Colombian history. So this is just, you know, really, really important to emphasize just how well organized and how active they are. Next slide, please, Elena. So the cocoa economy, as I've been emphasizing, has allowed campesinos to purchase their own farms, to build community infrastructure, to buy solar panels and televisions, to send their children to secondary school and even university. But as I mentioned earlier, this has come at a huge cost. As you can see in the survey response, when we asked people if cocoa production had increased violence in their region, overwhelmingly 77% said yes. And this violence can be attributed to both illegal armed groups, so rebel groups, right-wing paramilitary groups, as well as narco-trafficking organizations, but also to state forces. which tend to treat coca growers like criminals. Next slide, please. Because of the criminalization and demonization of coca producers in mainstream media and public discourse within Colombia, the people we interviewed often feel the need to explain that they are farmers, that we're not narcos, we're farmers. And so we decided to echo those statements in the 2020 Voices from the Borderlands report. And we put that in as one of our key messages, that coca growers are farmers and not narco criminals. If you look at the daily activity of the cocaleros, it's really very, not that different or very similar to what other farmers do. These farmers mostly rely on family labor. They tend to produce subsistence crops alongside their coca, as well as coca, things like corn, yuca, rice, plantain. And many of them cultivate coca because there are few or no viable commercial alternatives. That's important. This is their commercial crop, which is different to their subsistence crop. So as one woman put it, oops, that's 10 minutes. Wow. I have been rambling, apparently. I won't read the quote out then because we're running out of time. But I just wanted to emphasize, how this discourse is really important to the farmers themselves. We're farmers. We're not narcos. We're not criminals. We're not we're not toting guns. And there's a lot of resentment towards the state in that area. And next slide, please. This is the last slide, and then I'll finish. And it's completely understandable because the Colombian government's counter-narcotics policy focuses on the farmers and their coca crops more than anything else. It's its default counter-narcotics strategy. And that's what they've been prioritizing: forced eradication of coca crops, whether it be via aerial fumigation or manual eradication. And this has devastating consequences in places like Puerto Asís and Tumaco that depend on coca. These operations cause localized economic crises and a sudden loss of livelihood, and actually food insecurity. And a lot of people in the aftermath, for example, of aerial fumigation would go to the nearby towns requesting humanitarian aid because from one day to the next they had no way to feed their families, and they had to leave their homes. So we don't actually know how many people have been displaced due to these policies. But the point I'm trying to make here is that so-called successful counter-narcotics operations cause localized economic crises, and they impoverish people, and they revert, at least temporarily, the modest socioeconomic advances that the cocaleros achieve with their coca crops. So I hope this brief introduction was sufficient to illustrate the importance of the coca economy and counter-narcotics policies to development issues in Colombia's borderlands. And I believe over to Pat now, who's going to talk about our work in Myanmar.
Hi, everyone. As Jonathan said, my name is Patrick and I'm based in the Development Studies Department at SOAS, and I co-lead the Myanmar team on this project. And our work in Myanmar focuses on two states, Kachin State and Shan State, highlighted here in the map, in the country's borderland regions with China, India, and Thailand. This region has long been the epicenter of Asia's illegal drug production, covering opium, heroin, and in recent decades, methamphetamines. There's a particularly long history of opium production, which expanded significantly in the decades after Myanmar's independence from colonial rule in 1948. The opium economy played an important role in financing armed conflict between the central government and an array of armed groups that were based in the country's borderlands. It also provided a vital support for livelihoods of populations caught up in the conflict, in many ways similar to the phenomena that Frances has described around coca in Colombia. Our research in Myanmar has focused extensively on the experiences and legacies of a series of ceasefire agreements that were made in the late 1980s between the Myanmar government, or the military government at that time, and various ethnic armed organizations across Shan State and Kachin State. These ceasefires paved the way for significant changes in the political economy of drugs, conflict, and development in Myanmar's borderlands, which I will focus on in the rest of this talk. It's important to note that these borderland regions, although geographically marginal, are hugely rich in natural resources and are central now to the Myanmar economy. They're particularly rich in timber, mining, including jade, gold, amber, gemstones, rare earths, and also key agricultural frontiers for agribusiness development. The stability, or the fragile stability, that the ceasefires created through the 1990s and into the 21st century paved the way for a vast expansion in trade and resource extraction. Policy narratives, as Jonathan mentioned at the beginning of the talk, have typically framed the idea that peace, development, and tackling drugs can all be mutually enforcing. And there is a strong narrative within Myanmar that opening up borderland spaces for investment would provide strong foundations for reducing levels of armed conflict and tackling drug production. However, recent experiences in Myanmar very strongly challenge these assumptions. The drug traders continue to flourish, and Myanmar remains the second largest producer of illegal opium after Afghanistan, and is now also the main producer across Asia of methamphetamine pills and also increasing amounts of high-grade crystal meth. It's also important to note, if you change slides, sorry, Helena. Sorry, I forgot to say maybe a couple of slides. One more, yeah. There's also been a shift in perception surrounding the impact that drugs have had on local livelihoods and society. That opium had long been viewed as an important cash crop and was also associated with many positive uses, cultural, recreational, and medicinal. However, changing drug practices, especially around injecting heroin use and methamphetamines, has been viewed as having a much more damaging impact on local populations and has been seen as one of the defining features of borderland populations' experiences of borderland development over the past 20 years. So in the remainder of this talk, I want to focus on what accounts for this relationship between drugs, the increasing stability that emerged around the ceasefire arrangements, and processes of borderland development. So I want to focus first on how drugs have become embedded in systems of borderland governance and what our findings from the project have told us. It's important to emphasize that the drug trade has become deeply embedded in unresolved contests surrounding systems of political authority in Myanmar's borderland regions. These borderlands have never been under the firm control of the Myanmar state, and unresolved and ongoing processes of state formation underlie long-standing armed conflicts and informal systems of power sharing that were perhaps paused through the ceasefires but never reached a full resolution. And yet on top of this, you then had efforts by state and business actors to reconfigure these fragile and conflict-affected areas into key sites of resource extraction and economic development. And drugs became a part of the informal political settlements that tried to stabilize these regions. Negotiations around the drug trade in terms of who had the right to be involved and with what levels of protection and impunity became an important part of the informal deals that surrounded ceasefire negotiations. So I think a key point is that the drug economy thrives not because of a lack of governance or a lack of state control in these areas, but because of the relationship that emerged between the drug trade and emerging systems of frontier governance. This became particularly clear through the Myanmar military strategy of deploying local militias that acted as local counterinsurgency forces and also were used to provide the coercive muscle to underpin new forms of resource extraction and development. They facilitated land dispossession, protecting development projects, securing road networks, and then policing populations who've been adversely affected. Some of these militias number in the hundreds, or if not thousands, of troops, and opportunities to run legal and especially illegal businesses, including drugs, were a way of enabling these militias to become self-financing. It's also clear that as the state has gradually extended firmer control over many of these borderland regions, the official status of drugs as illegal has often been used by those in position of authority to establish small-scale protection rackets. The off-budget revenue streams have become instrumental in covering the costs of underfunded local authorities and creating opportunities to accumulate private wealth in otherwise badly paid jobs around the police, prison systems, village headmen, and even within the civil service. So drugs are thus deeply tied to ongoing processes of state formation based on trying to extend coercive control over contested spaces rather than addressing long-standing grievances through political dialogue. If you move on to the next slide, Helena. It's also clear that the drug trade became deeply embedded in systems of borderland development. That since the 1980s, there was a new development paradigm of market-led development emerged across many upland areas of Southeast Asia that gradually replaced the sort of quasi-socialist and statist models that had been seen in Burma, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, with post-socialist models of development focused on opening up borderlands to markets and capital, and focusing on regional economic integration in areas where previously there had been quite firm borders. In Myanmar, efforts to promote rapid development and the weak regulations around illicit activities and money laundering meant that very powerful connections emerged between the illegal and the legal economy, with heroin being described as the seed capital of the Burmese economy through the 1990s and 2000s. There were many notorious examples of private companies that emerged at this time who were led by former figures who had been instrumental in the drug economy, with drug money being sort of used to fund major infrastructure projects around highways, airports, and even the new capital in Myanmar, Naypyidaw. It was also clear that drug use became very much associated with key forms of development in these areas, especially around mining and resource extraction. They became a key part of the labor practices in very difficult, physically arduous and remote working conditions. It also tells a kind of complicated story around development in that even the greater stability and the opening up of more remote areas through road building in some ways were seen as positives, but were also seen as facilitating the spread of drugs and linked with worsening drug-related harms. And it's also important to note that in some areas, opium cultivation became a lifeline for farmers who faced increasing forms of insecurity from agribusiness developments, that large-scale land dispossession in lowland areas for rubber, maize, and other kind of global cash crops pushed farmers into more remote upland areas where opium became a vital livelihood strategy. So again, this was telling a story that drugs were kind of a reaction to new forms of economic development and rapid change in borderland areas, rather than an indication of these areas being marginalized and left behind. So just to wrap up now, because I'm running out of time, I guess a few conclusions that are coming out of the Myanmar work is that drugs are clearly not residual to processes of development and state formation, but are deeply embedded in the story of these processes in Myanmar. And that in place of sort of tired narratives around development as embodying win-win solutions for all, a focus on the relationship between illegal economies and development processes offers new ways of understanding the distributive impacts of development and the winners and losers of these processes. That in many ways what we've seen in Myanmar is the privatization of the gains of drugs and the socialization of the risks or the harms associated with it. That huge revenues from the drug trade in Myanmar are concentrated in the hands of quite small elites and have often been channeled into investment in urban centers, whether that's in Yangon or places like Kunming in Western China, or places like Thailand, in Thailand like Bangkok, Chiang Mai, and Singapore. And yet the increasing drug-related harms amongst borderland populations show the very real kind of human impacts that this has had on populations in borderland areas. And just as the final point, these experiences of the relationship between drugs and development, I think, offer really important but overlooked insights into the ongoing challenges facing Myanmar, and why narratives that have been so common in the peace process over the last decade, before the recent military coup, of the idea that development brings peace, have been treated with growing skepticism amongst those in Myanmar's borderlands who had experiences of ceasefire development and worsening drug harms. And I'll finish there and pass over to Jan, who's now going to look at some of the findings coming out of the Afghan work.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Jan Köhler. I joined the project a year ago, but have a longer history of research in Afghanistan since 2003, basically. The Afghan research is focused on 3 provinces, Nimruz, Nangarhar, and Badakhshan. These provinces share that the borderland population has long-standing historic networks and connections across the border into Iran, Pakistan, and Tajikistan. Otherwise, they're quite different from each other and very much reflect the diversity of demographic diversity, social cultural diversity of Afghanistan. Next slide, please. In this presentation, I will focus on the research in Nimruz and Nangarhar because the full set of methods has already been applied there for a longer time. Badakhshan is a little bit of a latecomer. So we'll focus on that. And these are just some impressions from the fieldwork of the OSDR field team conducting the qualitative and coming quantitative work, survey work, which is still planned. So basically here, I just want to highlight that the research is taking place in 2 provinces that have one official and very relevant for the national economy border crossing. That's Milak in Nimruz and Torkham in Nangarhar. But it also has a proliferation of smaller informal de facto transit points that have been shifting and changing over the past. And I will deal with that in a second. And these are, of course, to an extent more relevant for the local economies and the local political economy of borderland communities, who have much more access to these informal border crossings, which used to be quite open for Nangarhar and Nimruz without hardly any state interference, but that changed over the last couple of decades. So that is some impressions here from Nimruz, and then the next slide, Nangarhar. But there we have Torkham and some of the illicit goods passing. The better connected, of course, also use the official border crossings for larger deliveries of illicit goods, and we also have the informal border crossings. But let's move on because I have to have a look at to come to at the time management here. So basically, there are two sets of emerging results that I want to share with you for the discussion. One is more from a perspective of the life worlds of involved borderland communities, and the other one is then more on state effects and how that comes together via the functions provided by brokers. So in terms of a general observation, important general observation here, maybe also it has some similarities to Colombia and Myanmar, but also some important differences here, is that the drug economies in the borderlands that we are looking into are very much embedded in everyday life of people in the borderland region. And embedded here means that basically they have they are part of the agricultural life. They are not as specifically violent from the perspective of the farmers and low-level local traders economy. They are not perceived as something out of the ordinary with very high hurdles to access. Having said that, there is a degree of differentiation, of course, here if we compare those areas in borderlands that have a history of mostly opium poppy cultivation and those in which this crop came lately. So it's not all the same, but it's very much looked up on, and there have been long phases, not only the Taliban rule in the 1990s, in which the drug economy as part of the agricultural life has been treated as a normal part of the economy. And in Taliban-controlled areas, this is also the same today, or similar today. Now, in terms of economic development, the relationship between illicit drugs and the local economy is obviously not fixed. The distributive effects that are there, they vary at different points along the trading chain. But again, it's not that you have like oppressed lower level farmers and traders which are forced into this economy and controlled by big kinpins. You do have, of course, those who profit most, especially along the border, who can organize higher level trades, deliveries, are well connected, can use the official border crossings. But you also used to have, until recently, a very wide range of not only farmers being involved in the opium poppy economy, but also small level traders using the open borders more as a poverty reduction scheme and much more modestly, but widespread with quite open access. That is something that is really marking the Afghan opium poppy economy from the perspective of people that we are researching in those borderlands that we have researched so far. So I'm not sure that this can be generalized so far beyond that. Cross-border connectivity on the other end of the value chain can produce massive investments and opportunities, and we are looking particularly here at boomtown dynamics in Zaranj city, which used to be a totally forgotten administrative outpost in a desert. And over the last 15 years, thanks to the changing connection value of the connection into Iran, has turned into a real boom town with lots of infrastructural development in terms of mostly the size of the city, not so much, there's only one concrete factory emerged over the last couple of years, so not so much investment in factories processing, but in terms of building construction. And this is mostly related to cross-border trade and especially also to the illicit drug economy, cross-border economy. However, these benefits and negative effects are spread unevenly, obviously. So at the same time in Nimruz around Zaranj, we witnessed basically a complete outmigration, basically up to 50–60% of the population for different reasons, but they are not part of this process basically, and the more agricultural districts here are suffering and are being cut off these the casual access to the other side and casual smuggling. With violence also, and that is maybe a difference here to Colombia, that from the perspective of traders and communities and farmers involved and interviewed, the drug economy is not perceived as particularly violent, and that relates to the embeddedness most likely in the informal institutional self-regulation that is governing there. The political economy of local border communities in Afghanistan in general have a degree of violence, but it's not specific for the drug economy here. So that needs to be underlined here. It's not something out of the ordinary from the local perspective, and that is important. And it's also very much, I mean, the regulations, conflict regulations, mechanisms, and so forth that are there for onions, also there for the low-level drug economy. Next slide, please. So this everyday perspective, just on a side note here, we are not only like in academic publications trying to publish our findings here, we also use kind of audiovisual material, in this case a comic, where we turn some of the more interesting and telling life histories into into comics that highlight for the wider consumption some of the results that we have in terms of risks and incentive structures and strategies developing on the for people involved in the drug economy. So let's now turn to the next slide, where we look at state effects and the role of brokerage and how that changed. So in terms of state effects, I mean, far from being these kind of stateless borderlands, unruled and unruly, sometimes we get the impression here, and the Afghans also have the impression that there's too much state happening in their borderlands. There are differences, of course, here with Nangarhar being very much of central marginality, and Nimruz used to be quite a marginal place, but you have different kinds of states being active here and having an effect on borderlands. There's, of course, the Kabul government at different levels, then provinces and districts, which are not always in tune with each other. You have the neighboring states quite able to project their power and into the borderlands. You have the interveners, and very importantly, you have the functional contemporaries of the official state, that is the Taliban shadow, now more parallel government that is providing governance functions also in the borderland and projecting their power there. Some of these interventions tend to produce more consolidated, as you would expect, illicit networks, marginalizing smaller traders and transporters. Some of the interventions, not all of them, specifically the tightening of border controls by neighboring states, Pakistan and Iran, over the last 10 to 15 years, more intensely over the last 5 years, really having an effect on access of the cross-border economy here for local communities and changing the picture here very strongly. But also, and that is a repeated subject here in the interviews, selective counter-narcotics measures. Mostly by the Afghan government, that are basically applying selectively law enforcement mechanisms to enable some and push out others, sometimes for political reasons, very often also simply for economic reasons. This is one of the reasons why that is mentioned, why the insurgency, well, the Taliban governance, I should say, Daesh, worked quite differently with regard to the drug economy. The Taliban controlled areas is often preferred by traders and farmers and looked as favorable as compared to government. It seems to be simply more predictable. The terrorists seem to be more clear, and basically the governance, the Taliban governance of the drug economy is treating the drug economy as very much a normal agricultural economy, and that is something that the people can work with beyond ideological considerations here. So it's a kind of governance that works for traders, and it makes the trade and cultivation more accessible and more open. It's not always the case. I don't have time to go into that. We also have cases where Taliban governance completely doesn't work for the traders and they prefer setting up their own militias, but that's just a side note. Don't have time for everything here. Finally, state and Taliban interventions, both interventions by vertical power, increase the demand for brokerage and empower brokers with elite connections. So it's getting less. It's getting less open, free for all, and you need to solve the problems that are rising. People who are capable to mediate between those power centers, and we have a couple of very interesting cases here in which brokers even mediate on behalf of the traders. Tariffs and tax slips between state Taliban and militias so that they can do their business, because otherwise it was just getting totally unpredictable. And you need, of course, very specific people who can deliver that, and these people are getting their own power for that. So we're trying to understand the role of different kinds of brokers here. Okay, that's state effects and brokerage. Next slide, please. I have 2 slides with quotes here. I will not read the quotes yet back. I will just sum them up. Basically, one set of quotes you can just, while I speak for maybe 40 seconds more, is dealing with basically this difference between Taliban governance and state governance. The first one highlighting that it is still accessible if you are well connected and you have the resources to bribe, and you know whom to bribe in government controlled areas, but it's less predictable. And if you don't do it, you are just pushed out. Basically, you're pushed out by law enforcement being used against you, and you will just end up in jail, and you have to bribe yourself out of jail if you can do that. And the second one is then describing Taliban governance that is just more orderly from the perspective of the business here. It's also interesting that the interview partners use the term usha rather than bribe, usha in Texas for Taliban and bribe for government for pretty much the same fees that they have to pay, but in a more predictable way in Taliban lands. Okay, so that's the one summary of that. The last one is a broker. That's really interesting because he's a broker and a former district manager, as a governmental position, and also Jari Kumar long ago. But he took pride actually explaining us that he very much structured the cross-border smuggling He didn't talk about drugs. From other interviews, we then know that his family is also very much involved in that. It was more like a different kind of commodity being smuggled back across the informal border crossings. And he took pride as it. While I was governor, I was structuring that. I was mediating the conflicts. I was working on both sides. I was making it happen. And it worked for everyone. And this is confirmed by other representatives of communities there. But then basically, he lost his position, but at the same time, Pakistan shut off the border with new infrastructure and new regulations. And thousands of people went out of job, and the whole thing just backfired. And he is now busy organizing protest and some kind of resistance, basically trying to push the Kabul government to intervene with the Pakistani government to open up the informal border crossings again that the Pakistani side has taken under control, not shutting them completely, but regulating even the informal trade. And with that, I leave you with Jonathan.
Thanks, Jan. So I'll finish with a few very quick thoughts. And these are tentative. We have done a lot of research over the last 3 years, and we're still trying to work out what it all means. But a few kind of quick points to highlight here. I mean, the first thing is that all three presentations show that these borderlands are high risk and high opportunity environments. They're places of transformation, of disturbance, of reconfiguration. So in Terran terms, they're places of creative destruction. And what we're seeing across these three countries, although it varies from borderland to borderland and across country to country, that drugs can act as an accelerant. So they fuel processes of rapid accumulation, and they create new cartographies of risk and opportunity. This peripheral capitalism, if you like, it transforms the desert spaces of Nimrose, the Amazonian frontier region of Putumayo, into these key sites of illicit drug production. In Colombia, it provides an escape route for the peasantry as a form of resistance to the reproduction squeeze. It enables them to maintain a foothold on the land, to gain access to credit and to inputs. And it provides a form of social mobility and advancement, including investments, as Frances talked about, in public goods, in infrastructure, in education, and so on. And if we go to the frontier boom towns of Zaranj, and also on the Thai-Myanmar border, we can see export enclaves located on these key border crossings or choke points. And they generate, if you like, clusters or agglomerations of illegality in the form of casinos, prostitution, drug trafficking, all coming together. But also these forms of illegality are inseparable from the illicit economy. Drugs provide the startup capital for illicit businesses. It's shunted into the extractive industries, such as jade mines in Kachin State that Pat was talking about. And as our Colombia team often say in relation to their research, these borderland, kind of drug-fueled borderlands, we're seeing processes of actually existing development. Drugs are the alternative development in many of these places. And conversely, we can see, as Pat was talking about, that forms of extractive developments in this so-called ceasefire capitalism in Myanmar actually perversely pushes people into a closer relationship with drugs. These forms of accumulation through dispossession strengthen those links with illegality. So I guess one thing that's coming out is there's quite a lot of counterintuitive findings about this relationship between drugs and development, although it varies a lot between case to case. And it also shows that the distribution of the costs and benefits vary quite radically across cases and across time. Next slide, please, Helena. So we see these kind of sets of trade-offs that keep reappearing in different kind of ways across our cases. Drug fuel development is associated with major costs. And there's complex sets of relationships we need to unpack further in our research about the relationship between drugs and inequality and how this has varied in wartime and in peacetime. And quite perhaps counterintuitively, what appears to be happening in many of the spaces looking at post-war processes are associated with growing inequalities, and war economies may have more redistributive effects than so-called peace economies. So there's a need for us to think very carefully here about the sustainability and the distributive impacts of this kind of marginal development that we're seeing, and to think carefully about how these costs and benefits vary across space, across classes, and across genders and generations. And this idea that Pat has highlighted around the privatization of gains and the socialization of risks is something that's coming out very clearly across our borderland sites. Another thing that is coming out very clearly is the importance and the centrality of brokerage in understanding the dynamics of drug economies, that those who are involved in illicit economies don't have access to formal institutional mechanisms to mediate, to make claims, to mediate and manage conflicts. And so brokerage is crucial for those involved in producing and trafficking and using drugs. Finally, it's clearly we're trying to unpack the different kind of violences, as Jenny Pierce talks about this, that are going on around drug economies, how drugs can cement political settlements and stabilize political relationships, but they can also be associated with all forms of other forms of violence, including the slow violence of drug use and the coercive enforcement of counter-narcotics programs that Frances was talking about. Next slide, please. So two final points to finish off with, and this is the most speculative, but I guess this is trying to engage with some broader academic debates. One, many of you know the work of James Scott and the Art of Not Being Governed, and the way Scott talks about these kinds of frontier spaces as being non-state spaces where people have sought to evade the state building projects, in the case that he's talking about of the low-lying valley civilizations. People attempt to evade the state by remaining illegible, and they're barbarians by design, and conversely states attempt to make legible these unruly spaces, so they can be governed and resources can be extracted. And in many ways, what we've seen in our research is the opposite of this kind of claim. On the one hand, the state elites have an interest in maintaining these illegible and liminal spaces. They allow processes to happen, including rapid accumulation that may not be able to happen elsewhere. And conversely, borderland populations, the ones that we have spoken to, talk about the need for more states. They talk about state absence, but they want a state on different terms. Legibility enables them to make claims, to exercise voice, and to take collective action. And so there's a question here, it's about the art of being governed rather than into place. So the second area, where somewhat speculative again, but we would like to raise as a subject for this discussion. Helena, can you move on? That's it, yeah. And what we try to show here in our borderland kind of vignettes is a kind of relational approach. And that's the idea that the character of the whole can be shown sharply by attention to the edges. So these are peripheries, are interesting places in their right, but they're also a privileged vantage point for understanding how power relations and how markets operate at the center, how these are at least in part by what is happening in the periphery. The need to better understand the margins and how they're integrated into global, regional, and national political economies. And our research is showing that there's forms of adverse incorporation going on through which the margins have been historically interconnected to the networked integrative processes, how they work and how they continue to work to the disadvantage of borderland populations is a key challenge. And it relates to a kind of a policy discourse, something that David Harvey calls a diffusionist narrative, the idea that the pathologies of the margins can be addressed through more states and more market. And our research suggests that such an antidote tends to reinforce these structural forms of marginality going on in the board that connect the center to the periphery. Finally, as we've hinted at, liminality and illegality can be functional. Illegible borderlands can perhaps be, for late developing countries, the equivalent of special economic zones. They enable processes of rapid accumulation that cannot take place elsewhere. And to pursue this analogy further, and drawing on Jun Chang's argument about late developing countries having the ladder kicked away from them, do borderlands constitute for political elites of late developing states an alternative kind of ladder? They're places where state builders can pursue the unsavory strategies of their European predecessors that are disallowed or at least moderated elsewhere by the mantras of good governance, human rights, and equitable development. Finish, Helena, and look at
so much, Jonathan and the rest of the team for this presentation. I will now stop the recording so that we can